After the divorce, I ended up with an old apartment in the city center in a building over 100 years old. The first time I opened the door, I was enveloped by a strange feeling. The air felt stale and heavy, as if centuries of sighs and forgotten secrets were trapped inside. But I tried to shake off these odd sensations, blaming them on exhaustion after a long day. The strange occurrences began on the very first evening. While making coffee in the kitchen, I caught a glimpse of something moving out of the corner of my eye. I turned. No one was there. A shadow flickered by the window, disappearing as quickly as it had appeared. My heart raced, but I told myself it was just a trick of the light. I was sure it was only stress playing tricks on me, but a subtle nagging feeling of unease settled within me. That night, sleep was elusive. I tossed and turned, trying to shake off the growing sense of unease. At one point, it felt as though someone was standing in the corner of my bedroom, watching me from the darkness. I didn't dare open my eyes, afraid that if I looked, I wouldn't be able to turn away. Panic took hold of me, and I only managed to drift into a restless sleep just before dawn. The next day, I returned to work, trying to distract myself from the night's anxieties. I told myself it was just the stress of the divorce and moving in. But that evening, the feeling returned, that sense of a foreign gaze following me around the apartment. I felt as if someone invisible was silently watching me from a dark corner. Days passed, and the feeling of dread became an inescapable part of my life. I couldn't explain it, but I felt that something or someone else was with me in the apartment. Sometimes I heard faint footsteps, as though someone was creeping down the hallway, or a barely audible whisper echoing from the walls. Each night, my fear grew stronger, turning familiar things into terrifying signs. One night, I lay awake again, staring at the ceiling in the darkness, listening to my own breathing, loud and heavy. Then I felt as though someone was standing behind me. Trying to stay calm, I turned and switched on the light. The room lit up, and for a moment, everything seemed normal. But when I looked at the wall, I froze. There was a shadow on the wall, and it wasn't mine. A human figure seemingly frozen mid-movement. My throat tightened, and I felt the blood drain from my face. I tried to rationalize it, but this time, no explanation came. In the silent apartment, it felt like even the walls were breathing. I sat there for a long time, staring at the strange shadow until it faded away, dissolving into the darkness. That night, sleep didn't come. I sat on the bed until morning, feeling the invisible presence of the house closing in around me. A few days later, I found an old notebook. It was tucked away on the top shelf of the closet, and I couldn't recall anyone mentioning it before. Its pages were filled with hurried, illegible handwriting, chaotic entries about the apartment. The previous tenant had also heard footsteps, seen shadows, and felt a presence. His entries grew more and more panicked. The final line burned into my memory. "It's here and it won't let me go. It's becoming part of me." Those words left a painful mark on my mind. I tried to rid myself of paranoia, convincing myself that it was just my imagination. But the fear, like an ancient predator, settled into the apartment, waiting for the moment to fully consume me. Since then, I avoided mirrors as much as possible. Every time I passed by one, I felt as though something wasn't quite right. One day, as I walked past the mirror in the hallway, I saw my shadow, but it seemed delayed by a second, moving with a slight lag. I stopped, and the shadow stopped too. But there was something foreign and watchful in its stance. The final straw came one morning when I noticed the shadow on the bedroom wall again. This time, it didn't try to hide. It was sharper than ever, standing across from me, observing my every move. I felt a strange, oppressive weight coming from it, and suddenly I understood. This shadow wasn't just watching me, it was trying to become me. For the last few nights, I barely slept, fearing that if I drifted off, the shadow would take control. I could feel its presence growing, seeping into me, slowly clouding my mind. I started losing track of my thoughts, barely able to tell where I ended and something else began, something dark and formless. Eventually, I broke down and called an old friend, the one person I still trusted. He came over, looking at me with concern, but also with confusion in his eyes. I tried to explain, but the words came out with difficulty. The sensation of the shadow consuming me had become overwhelming. My friend tried to persuade me to leave, even if just for a while. I agreed, deciding it was the only way out. While packing my things, I took one last look at the wall where the shadow appeared each night. It was no longer there, but I could feel it deep inside me. Leaving the apartment, I knew this wasn't the end. Now, even in my new place, I sometimes see strange shapes on the walls. And every time I see them, I can't shake the thought that the shadow that lived with me in that old apartment is still here, waiting and watching. I recently moved into this house on the outskirts of town. It's a modest two-story building, unremarkable at first glance. The house was cheap, and at the time I thought it was the best I could find. But from the very first nights I realized something was wrong with this place. The first night was unsettling. I woke around 3 o'clock to a strange noise. Initially, I thought it was just the wind rattling the windows or someone passing by on the street. But the sound didn't stop. It was coming from somewhere within the wall. I listened closely, trying to make it out a soft, barely discernible voice. It whispered so quietly that it almost blended with the silence of the night, but I was certain it wasn't just my imagination. I turned on the light and walked around the house, trying to find the source. I almost convinced myself it was just the sounds of an old building settling, but when I returned to bed, the whisper returned persistent, as if someone was just on the other side of the wall, calling to me. Yet there was no voice. Only the eerie feeling that I was not alone. In the morning, I decided to speak with the neighbors. It turned out that this house had stood empty for several years, and none of the previous tenants had stayed long. When I asked if anyone else had heard anything like this, the neighbors avoided answering, quickly steering the conversation in another direction. One of them, an elderly man, gave me a long, strange look and said only one thing: "Don't give in." That night, as I tried to sleep, I heard the whisper again. This time it was a bit louder. I thought I heard the voice say my name. Slowly, as if testing the sound of it, a wave of cold ran through me as I heard it. But the worst part was that the voice wasn't coming from the wall. It was right next to me, as if someone was standing by my bedside. Each night, the whispers grew more insistent. I tried to ignore them, but by the third night, I could no longer sleep. The moment I closed my eyes, the soft, persistent voice would start, so close, as though someone were right there. Sometimes it felt like I could feel breath on my skin, as if something were leaning over me, barely touching. With each whisper, fear seeped through my body. It felt as though the voice was becoming a part of me, clawing its way into my mind, and each day I could feel myself losing control. Exhaustion set in, and I could barely keep myself together at work. My colleagues began to ask questions, noticing how worn out I looked, but I had no idea how to explain that something unexplainable haunted me every night. By the fifth night, I decided to record it. I needed proof that I wasn't losing my mind. I left the recorder on my bedside table and tried to sleep. As soon as I turned off the light, the whispering filled the room again. At first, it was faint, almost inaudible, but gradually, it grew louder. In the morning, I played the recording. I heard my own quiet, uneasy breathing, but there was something else, a whispering shadow, as if trying to speak to me. I listened to it over and over, unable to believe my ears. The voice was calling me, coaxing me to open my eyes, to look into the darkness, repeating the same phrase, "You have to see me." These words haunted me throughout the day. That evening, as night fell, I sat alone in the dark, terrified of hearing that voice again. I didn't want to hear it anymore, but I knew I couldn't escape it. That night, the whisper was more insistent. It called me, pulling me toward the darkness. My mind fought the strange urge, but I could feel a force compelling me to give in. I tried not to listen, but the voice grew louder. It was everywhere now, in the walls, outside the window, in every corner. On the sixth night, I woke up in the middle of the room, though I didn't remember getting out of bed. The voice was closer, and now it was saying my name as if we'd known each other for years. I could feel that this presence knew everything about me, as if it had been watching my every move. I no longer had the strength to resist. That night, despair grew within me, and the voice seemed to savor it. It became more commanding, almost ordering me to approach the window and look at my reflection. It felt as though, if I did, I would finally see who was behind this voice. But instead of my own reflection, I saw something else in the glass, a dark silhouette. Distant, but with a strange expression, a mixture of triumph and madness. I took a step back, but the shadow didn't disappear. It remained, unblinking, as if waiting for me to give in. The last few nights in this house became a torture. I barely slept, afraid of seeing that shadow again. The voice was relentless, insistent, and endless, calling me to the window, promising peace if I just looked. On the 8th day, I couldn't take it anymore. That night, the voice was louder than ever. It almost demanded that I go to the window. I walked over, feeling my heart pounding in my chest. As I approached the window, I saw my reflection, but it wasn't mine. It was looking back at me with a twisted smile. I stood, staring at my own reflection, and then I heard the lips in the reflection whisper in a voice that echoed in my mind, "Now you've seen me." The next moment, I felt a weight fill my chest, swallowing the last of my will. Everything around me blurred, and through the haze, I saw my reflection begin to separate from me, taking on a form of its own. It took a step forward, leaving me frozen in place like a statue. The last thing I remember is the eerie grin on my own reflection's face before it disappeared into the darkness. In the morning, the neighbors found me standing by the window as if in a trance. I don't remember how much time has passed since then. Sometimes it feels like I'm still standing there, and sometimes I feel like it's not really me. Now the voice is constant, sinister, and piercing, like an echo locked inside me. It's been just over a week since I moved into this house. I was looking for a cheaper place to live, and this small apartment seemed like a stroke of luck. Nothing special, just one room, a kitchen, a bathroom. But from the moment I moved in, the silence of this place started to weigh on me. Even at night, when I closed my eyes, I could feel that the sounds disappeared. A deep, almost dense silence always surrounded me here. The first night, I barely slept. In this unusual silence, I could hear my own breathing and, it seemed, even the beating of my heart. The second night was worse. I noticed that every little movement, no matter how quiet, seemed unnaturally loud. Any motion brought a sense of unease, as if I wasn't supposed to move at all. That night, lying in bed, I heard something strange. A faint sound, maybe a sigh, maybe a soft moan. I opened my eyes and looked toward the door, but saw nothing. Just darkness, but the sound didn't go away. At first, I thought it was the wind or the creaking of old furniture, but then I realized the sound wasn't coming from the room. It was inside me. The next night, I woke up with a heavy feeling. Something was pressing on my chest, making it hard to breathe and keeping me from moving. I froze, listening to the silence. And then I heard it again. A faint sound, an almost imperceptible whisper. Sitting up in bed, I felt the hair on the back of my neck stand up. It seemed like something inside me was trying to speak, trying to break out. I shook my head, trying to dispel the thoughts. But each day, the sounds grew louder, as if some foreign voice was attempting to form words but was being suppressed. I began to avoid silence. Even at work, in a noisy office, it felt like I could hear the whisper. At first, it was barely recognizable words, fragments of phrases that vanished in the daily hum. But at home, everything intensified. It felt like the voice was calling me by name, reaching out to me as if it knew me down to the smallest detail. One night, just as I was drifting off to sleep, the voice became too clear. It seemed to burst out of my own thoughts, disrupting the familiar rhythm of sleep, and whispered, "Can you hear me?" I jolted awake, trembling with fear, realizing that I couldn't escape it. I tried to convince myself it was just exhaustion, but the voice was so real that I couldn't ignore it. I decided to see a doctor. The general practitioner couldn't explain the phenomenon and referred me to a psychologist. The psychologist suggested it might be due to stress, lack of sleep, and exhaustion. But even after his assurances that it was just my imagination, the whisper didn't go away. On the contrary, it grew stronger. The next night, I woke up to a sharp tingling in my chest. I lay still, paralyzed by fear, feeling my entire body freeze. And then I heard the voice, clearer and more menacing, as if something had broken through the thin barrier separating me from it. "Can you hear me?" it repeated. I couldn't respond. Lying in the dark, I tried to suppress my panic, but the voice seemed to revel in my fear. It kept speaking as chills ran down my spine, as if it wanted to seize my thoughts, take control of my mind. That's when I decided. The next day, I bought a recorder and left it on, hoping to capture the strange voice and prove to myself that I wasn't losing my mind. When night fell, I turned on the recorder and lay in bed, waiting for another wave of terror. When I woke up in the morning, the recorder was still on. Listening to the recording, I could hear my own quiet, restless sleep. But there was something else on the tape, a low, whispering voice, barely audible, repeating, "Can you hear me?" I felt a chill down to my bones. The voice was real. It existed. Every day I felt more strongly that something dark and sinister was entwining itself around my mind. The voice kept whispering to me, saying it knew everything about me, that it wouldn't let me go. I began hearing it even during the day, outside, among people. I felt as if something was living inside me, as if this voice had seized my thoughts. One day I found myself sitting on the floor in the middle of the room, unable to remember how I got there. I was holding the recorder in my hands and on the tape. Once again I heard the words spoken in that eerie voice, "I'm here, under your skin." After that I knew I had to leave this house. I packed my things and left, hoping to leave this nightmare behind. But the silence didn't leave. In every new place, wherever I went, I kept hearing that voice. It stayed with me.